the next several weeks, there's something that I want to do that's a little bit different, and I want to just give you some little tidbits of what God's up to in our church, and it's going to lead us somewhere. I'm not going to tell you where that somewhere is, because by faith you have to trust that I'm going to lead you somewhere. But it's some little tidbits, and here's what I want you to know. I want you to see what God's up to in our church. About 8 months ago, I made a commitment to you, and I said, hey, God's calling us to do something pretty big, and we're going to go and we're going to build a new building, and we're going to do some really cool things. And God is at work behind the scenes doing all those things, and it's really, really been great to watch Him put all the pieces together. But the commitment that I made to you was not that we would build a building, but that in spite of us building a building, that we would not forsake ministry. And we would keep our mind focused on what matters most, and that's Jesus and advancing His kingdom, not building a structure. As important as that is, and as much as I love worshiping and air conditioning, that's not what we exist for. We exist for the worship of Jesus and Him alone and advancing His kingdom. And so I've got a slide I want to show you. Since November 20th of last year, we did a commitment Sunday, and it was a really sweet moment as everybody in the church came down and laid their commitments down and said, yes, we're going to be all in for this church and for what God's calling us to do. And since then, here's some things that we've seen, which is some pretty cool stuff. I just want you to know, in the last 8 months, we've had at least, probably more than this now, but we've had at least 57 folks join our church, and so we're thankful that God continues to bring people to us. It's cool. In 8 months, we've had 120 people go on 8 different trips all over the globe. It's pretty cool. We're staying focused on what God's called us to do. We've had 26, I know we've had more now. We've had over 26 baptisms. Great, yeah. It's awesome, man. We've had 198 students who were sent to camp, who were just poured into, and many of which gave their lives to Jesus, many of which took their next steps with Christ, and we just praise God for that. 205 kiddos who were a part of VBS this year, which was just awesome. I don't know if you've been a part of VBS. I would encourage you next year that if you can be a part of that, it's an incredible time. We have 115 children who are being discipled weekly, which is great. We have 369 volunteers who serve FBB, our church, and the community. Man, that's incredible, right? I mean, in the day in which is the common theme is everybody's so busy, we have 369 people who sacrifice their time and their resources to serve our church. I'm honored by that. As far as missionaries funded, we have several different ways that we do that. We fund individual missionaries, but we also fund missionaries through the IMB and through the North American Mission Board. And so we've got 10 individuals and couples that we're supporting individually, which is awesome. But then over and beyond that, man, we've got thousands of people who are supported every month by your faithful giving and generosity. And so I just want you to know, I've got more coming. This is just a few things. We've got more coming over the next couple weeks that I want to share with you. I just only have time for this much. So I don't have time for all the things I want to show you and share with you. So that'll happen over the next couple weeks. But God's doing great things in and through you. I want you to hear me say that very clearly. God is doing great things in and through you. If it weren't for you showing up, and if it weren't for your commitment, and if it weren't for your generosity, these things don't happen, right? And so thank you for being all in. And I would encourage you just to continue to be all in. Whatever that looks like for you, and whatever God's calling you to do, step into it. Step into it, because He's gonna use you. He'll use you. Okay, here we go. All right, let's get your Bibles out. We're gonna be in Hebrews chapter 11. We're gonna cover verse 7. Today. That's going to be the lens by which we look at a story in the Bible in Genesis 6. So I'm actually going to tell you to put your finger in the Hebrews passage, but then we're going to jump over to Genesis chapter 6, because we're going to spend a bulk of our time there, and then we'll come back to the Hebrews 11 passage as a lens to understand what God's teaching us in Genesis 6, okay? And while you're turning there, I want you to think about something. I want you to think about the importance of light. You know, we have light all around us. Some is bright, some is warm, some is shining. But I think often, 21st century, right? These are first world problems. I think all too often we can take light for granted. And I don't know that I would have said that until about 2 years ago when Ice-Mageddon hit. Y'all remember that? Yes, man. I think we went 5 days without power. That was the first time in my adult life where I've ever gone without power for a particular period of time. And by going without power meant we also didn't have light. And I remember it felt like as the sun was going down, so too would my hope. Right? Like I would watch the sun go down and I'm like, Lord, please don't let the sun go down. And yet it was in the winter time, which means what? The sun goes down at like 5:30. So the sun's going down, and Jordan and I are looking at each other completely unprepared for this, where we don't have nearly enough candles and we don't have enough flashlights. And it's that moment when I'm like, Lord, why did I not go get batteries? I knew I needed batteries. I don't have batteries. And so the sun's going down, and I'm kind of in that little panic mode of like, what are we going to do now? It's 5:30. We haven't even had dinner, and I'm not going to be able to see you. It's kind of like, it's amazing when you lose the light, how it feels like hope just kind of wanes, right? And I think that's because hope or light offers us a certain amount of hope. It brings clarity. It exposes things otherwise left in the darkness. I think light is hope. Brings clarity, exposes things otherwise in the darkness. Now, in our story this morning, I think what you're going to see here is that it's almost as though the light in the world is exchanged for darkness. It's like the sun goes down in the hope of the world that you're going to see here in Genesis chapter 6, beginning in verse 5. So look there, Genesis 6, verse 5. This is the Lord observing what has happened to creation. Okay, so I want you to let the text kind of sit on your heart a little bit heavy this morning, okay? I'm going to bring hope in later, but right now we're going to talk about the hard stuff. Okay, Genesis chapter 6, the Lord looks out over creation. This is post-fall, and here's what he observes. It says that the Lord saw the wickedness of man was great on the earth. Notice how he describes the wickedness. And that every intention of the thoughts of man's heart was only evil continually. Think about that. We think the world today is bad. Look at the weight of this, that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And hear the weight of this. And the Lord regretted that he had made man on earth. It grieved him to his heart. And so the Lord said, I will blot out man whom I have created from the face of the land, man and animals and creeping things and the birds of the heavens, for I am sorry that I have made them. Drop down to verse 11. Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence. And God saw the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their way on earth. I mean, do you feel the weightiness of that description of the world of that time? Do you feel the weight and the heaviness of God's emotion as he observes what has happened to his creation? I mean, gosh, it's heart-wrenching if you think about the fact that God's perfect world that he created, filled with light and life, is now consumed with darkness and death. You feel the weight of that. I mean, to the degree that God regretted all that he created altogether. Literally, it means that God's heart was filled with sorrow. It would be kind of like that moment, right? I don't know if this has ever happened to you, where you come home from work or you come home from being away from the house, you walk in your door and you open it up and you realize that somebody has broken into your home. Somebody who shouldn't have been there has been there, and they've literally left your house a wreck. You know that feeling of like, man, somebody was here that wasn't supposed to be here? Like, this is the feeling that we have in this text. This is the emotion that you have in this text as God peers into his creation filled with light and life that's now just exchanged with darkness and death, and sorrow fills his heart because of what you and I did. It's that weighty feeling of sorrow over what has happened. So verse 13 tells us what God does. The text says that he determined. He determined to make an end of all flesh, for the earth is filled with violence through them. Therefore, I will destroy them with the earth. The corruption on the earth had gotten so bad, it was so great, that God felt like the only solution to this problem is to just start all over. Nevertheless, in spite of all of these things, that darkness and the wickedness on the earth, in spite of all of it, God's grace remains even still. See, in the midst of the darkness, God is actively pushing back the darkness, ushering in light. And here's what he does, right? He raises up this man named Noah, and God's gonna call him to do something pretty incredible. And that is, through Noah, God is gonna preserve a remnant of light and life and hope on the earth that is now filled with darkness. And so God does that. He raises up Noah and his family. And I want you to see how Noah is described here, because it's pretty incredible the way that he's described. In verses 8 and 9, look at that. It says that Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. Noah was a righteous man. He was blameless in his generation, for Noah walked with God. This is how Noah's described. He's described as a righteous man. I mean, think about, what do you want on your tombstone when you go to be with the Lord? That's a pretty good descriptor right there. A righteous man, blameless in my generation, walked with God. I don't think I can think of a better descriptor. That's what Noah's described as. He's described as a person who is righteous. As we're going to see through the story of Noah's life, that his faith on earth is what made him righteous. His faith and his belief in God and belief that God was going to do what he said he was going to do is what made him right. Remember Hebrews chapter 11, verse 2, it says this, that by faith, these were commended as righteous. So it wasn't so much what Noah did or what he didn't do, but the fact that he just believed in the existence of God and believed that what God said he was going to do, he was going to do. And when God comes to Noah and says, I want you to do this crazy thing, and Noah does it, he just believed that God was going to do what God was going to said he was going to do, and therefore he counted him as righteous. It was not awarded to him by what he did or what he didn't do, but by believing that God was real and that what God said would come true. Now, as a result, he lived a righteous life before the Lord. That's what he means to say that he was righteous. He was also described as one who was blameless. Now, for you and I, when we hear that word, we think, well, does that mean that Noah was perfect? I didn't think there was anybody that was perfect on this earth except for Jesus. Well, tell you what it doesn't mean. It doesn't mean that Noah was perfect. And you want to know how I know that? Because if you keep reading in the story of Noah's life, you get to chapter 9. And you know what happens in chapter 9? Anybody remember what happens in chapter 9? Noah gets off the ark, and I don't know why. I don't know what happened in his life. I don't know if he was seeing a counselor or not. But I will tell you this much. He gets off of that boat, and he finds himself on a drunken binge weekend, and he gets so drunk that he passes out and blacks out to the point where his sons find him naked. His sons cover up his shame, and then when Noah comes to and realizes all the things that had happened, what does he do? Instead of blessing his sons and saying, hey guys, thanks for having having a brother's back, he ends up cursing them. Was Noah perfect? No. Noah wasn't perfect. He was just as sinful as you and I, right? He was sinful just like you and me. It wasn't that Noah was perfect. What it means to be blameless is to be a person of integrity. It means that you're the same person behind closed doors as you are in public. While Noah wasn't a perfect guy, he was still a person of integrity. He lived his life before the Lord. Then finally, it says that Noah was described as a person who walked with God. Does anybody remember what we talked about last week on what it means to walk with God? Remember, to walk with God just simply means, right, that we're going to agree to walk in his direction. We're going to follow his path. We're going to walk according to his path. And we're going to walk at his pace. That's what it means to walk with the Lord. And here's what's crazy about Noah. Over the course of their relationship, here's what happens. God comes to Noah and he begins to share his heart with him about the wickedness in the world and then his plan to start all over. Can you imagine that God trusting Noah so much so that he comes to him and he says, hey, I want to tell you what's happening. And here, by the way, here's what I'm going to do. By the way, did you know that when you walk with the Lord, here's what happens over the course of your time walking with the Lord? Your fellowship ought to grow to a certain degree, right? That God begins to share his heart with you. And over the course of time, he begins to share his vision for your life and his calling for your life. It happens when you position yourself to walk with the Lord, to hear from him. And Noah does that. And so God tells him, he says, hey, listen, this is what's going to happen. Here's the vision that I have for your life. I want you to build an ark. And by building an ark, I'm going to cause all this rain to come and floods are going to rise. And this ark is going to represent my saving grace to a wicked humanity. And keep this in mind because this is kind of crazy. So generally all scholars and theologians agree. They don't agree on everything when it comes to Noah, but here's what they will agree on. That Noah lived inland. You know what that means? That means he lived far away from a body of water, and there were no airplanes, there were no trains, and there were no cars, which means there's a good chance that Noah had never even seen a large body of water. And yet here it is that God's calling Noah to build a boat of which he's never seen for a large body of water that is coming, of which he has never seen. You imagine that? This is the calling that God has on Noah's life. And then he tells him the reason why. In verse 17, he goes, Noah, I'm going to bring a flood of waters upon the earth to destroy all flesh, in which is the breath of life under heaven. Everything that is on the earth shall die. But notice what he says in verse 18. He says, but I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall come into the ark, you, your sons, your wife, and your sons' wives with you. And of every living thing of all flesh, you shall bring 2 of every sort into the ark to keep them alive with you. They shall be male and female, of the birds according to their kinds, and of the animals according to their kinds, of every creeping thing of the ground according to its kind. 2 of every sort shall come into you for you to keep them alive. Also take with you every sort of food that is eaten and store it up. It shall serve as food for you and for them. And then notice what he says in verse 22. This is really important. Noah did this. In fact, he did all that the Lord had commanded him. I think that's really important. When you keep in mind what God has called Noah to do, I want you to notice Noah's response. He just simply obeyed the Lord. You know, again, theologians and commentators agree that after God comes to Noah, this is pretty wild. After God comes to Noah and says, hey, just so you know, I want you to build an ark. I'm going to wipe the planet. And here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to bring rain and floods are going to rise and all of that. When God comes to Noah and he tells him that, here's what we know. That it was somewhere around 100 to 120 years before Noah ever saw a single drop of rain. Think on that. From the moment that God comes to Noah and says, hey, Noah, this is what I want you to do. It was 100 to 120 years before Noah ever saw a drop of rain. Y'all, that's an entire lifetime living in obedience to what God asked him to do. And in, how many words was that? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. In 10 words, the verse says, Noah did this. He did all that God commanded him. 120 years. That's an entire lifetime. Can you imagine how many times Noah thought, golly, this is crazy. Maybe I'm as nuts as everybody says I am. Why am I doing this? Is it really worth it? I mean, think about it. He's a human just like you. And here God has called him to do this crazy thing, and yet Noah is obedient for 100 to 120 years before he ever sees a single result of his faithfulness. Wow. Now, here's what happens. We see that God is faithful. Chapter 7, verse 11 says this, that in the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, on the 7th day of the month, on that day, all of the fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of the heavens were opened, and rain fell upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights. As the rain begins to fall, I think Noah and his family begin to do like, oh gosh, it's happening. they're probably as shocked as anybody else was. And so what do? They hurry into the ark. They help all the animals. They're like, okay, God, we know what God said to do. Here it is. It's time. We got to do it. And so they're doing it, right? And then look at what happens in verse 16. I love this. It says, as they all get in the ark, the text says, and God shut them in. Right? It's this beautiful sign of God's faithfulness and his protection to save them in the midst of such a tragedy. And soon thereafter, the rains prevail, the floods begin to rise. All of a sudden, the boat lifts up off of land and it begins to float. And if you keep on reading, you're going to see that God is faithful to do exactly what he says he's going to do when he says he's going to do it. As much of a tragedy as this is, God is faithful to do exactly as he says. So that's the story of Noah and the ark. Kind of hard to put all of that in on a felt board, but nevertheless, we've done it over the years. Now, there's a lot of things that I love about this story. There's things that we could talk about where we talk about God's wrath and his justice over sin. We could talk about that. We could talk about God's love and compassion to save Noah and his family. We could talk about how God is preserving a salvation and demonstrating how Noah in the ark paints a picture for what we have coming down in years of history of Jesus and him being the savior for humanity. We can talk about that. But one of the things that I want us to see is from the lens of, we're going to see this in a minute, from Hebrews chapter 11. What is it that the author of Hebrews 11 wants us to see? And I think part of what he wants to see is what Peter describes in 1 Peter 2, 9 through 10. Here's what Peter says. Peter describes the Christian life, and here's what he says, because I think he's also helping us understand this story a little bit too. He says that you are a chosen race, speaking of Christians, Christ followers. He says, you are a chosen race. In other words, you're a new people. You're a royal priesthood. You're a holy nation, a people for his own possession. This is going to make sense in just a second. By the way, that's your identity. If you're a Christ follower in this room, there's a lot of things that the world's going to say about you. There's a lot of things that you're going to think about yourself. There's a lot of things that are going to pull for your attention. But I want you to hear me clearly because this is your identity. You're a chosen race. You're a new people. You're a royal priesthood. You are an ambassador for Christ on this earth. You're a holy nation. You were created to be holy, set apart. You're a people for his own possession, right? Jesus tells us that there's nothing that you can do to outrun the grace of God, outrun his love. Once he's got you in his grasp, you can't get out of it. That's your identity. Now, here is the reason why this is your identity. This is your purpose statement. So that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. Listen, this is Peter describing for us what happened to Noah. In Noah's day, living in darkness, God calls him out of the darkness in which he lived into God's light so that he would reflect the light of God into a dark world. In the same way, you and I, who claim to be Christ followers, we are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for his own possession, so that you might reflect the light of Christ where you live, where you work, and where you play. That is the calling that God has on your life this morning. God has not called you just to go through life with no purpose, with no meaning. He has given you a unique identity as his people so that you would reflect his image, his transformed image in Christ. You would reflect that image, that light on this earth. That is your calling on this earth, where you live, where you work, where you play. That means everywhere you go. Your mission is to push back darkness and to usher in light. It's to offer hope, bring clarity, and to help people see where they can find salvation in Christ, in him alone. Now, one of the ways that we do that, I want to talk about how we do that because that's what Hebrews 11:7 is going to help us see. Right? Let's get a little practical. So Hebrews 11 verse 7, read this with me. Hebrews 11:7 says, by faith Noah, being warned by God concerning events as yet unseen, in reverent fear, constructed an ark for the saving of his household. By doing so, he condemned the world and he became an heir of the righteousness that comes by faith. Now, there's a kind of a weird phrase. I want to tackle the weird phrase, and then we're going to jump into a little bit of the meat here. By condemning the world, what the author means, to the best of my ability, is that Noah's righteous living exposed the darkness around him. He brought hope to the lost. He offered clarity of salvation, right? That's what he means, right? So by his life, he condemned the earth, meaning he brought clarity to salvation, and he brought hope in the midst of darkness, okay? Now, let's jump back here, because I don't want you to miss this. Your calling is to push back darkness and to usher in light. That's every Christian's calling on this earth. But how do we do that? What does that look like? Well, it begins with God's unique calling and vision for your life. See, God calls Noah, right? And God calls Noah to do something pretty wild. He calls him to build an ark. In the midst of the darkness of the world and everything that's going on around him, the calling that Noah had on his life was to build and construct an ark. And by the way, Noah positioned himself to receive that vision as he walked with God. Now, this morning, whether you realize it or not, God has a unique calling on your life. I don't know what that is. I'm not the one who can give that to you. You have to be walking with the Lord and position yourself in such a way as to receive that calling. And some of you in this room, your calling might be to build an ark. It might be something so crazy that you can't even get your mind around, and yet God is calling you to do something wild like building an ark. There's some of you in the room this morning that are like Noah's family, who are called to support somebody who's building an ark. There are others of you in this room that, because of the unique circumstances that you're in right now, I don't know what those are, where you just need to be close to the people who are building an ark and supporting an ark. And so you just need to be in the room and you just need to receive and you just need to be ministered to because your heart is going through some stuff. But God has a unique calling on your life, and there's this kind of macro calling, right? Where you're called to be a light, and God's calling you over the course of your life to do something that might seem pretty crazy. But then at the same time, there's also that micro calling in your life. There's that micro vision, micro plan that God has for your life, and that's just moment by moment faithfulness. You know, that might mean that, you know, you're in your workplace and man, you just need to be a person of integrity in a company that is not a company of integrity. That might mean that you need to walk away from that job. It might mean that you need to step up for somebody who's being bullied at school, and you know that it's gonna make you look a little uncool. And man, you've worked really, really hard to get into the crowd, the in crowd, and yet here we are, and you know that the Lord's calling you to step away from that. Maybe that means you need to separate from an abusive relationship. Maybe for you to be light, you need to do something really, really, really extreme. Maybe you need to sell your house. Maybe God's calling you to adopt a kid. Maybe God's calling you to be more generous than you ever dreamed you ever could be. Maybe God's calling you to walk across the room right now and to just simply say, I'm sorry. For you to be light in a dark world. Maybe God's calling you like he did me this week, where quite frankly, I did not behave in a way that I should have. And I had friends around me, and I had to go to them and say, guys, I'm sorry, I should be more godly than that. By the way, did you know to be light doesn't always mean that you're perfect, but that you're quick to reconcile and admit fault? That's just as much of being light as it is of doing all the right things. In a broken, imperfect world, you and I are gonna mess up. And so it's a matter of, are we gonna reconcile in the midst of a world who doesn't wanna reconcile, who doesn't wanna say sorry, who doesn't wanna own up to their stuff, who doesn't wanna take responsibility for their sin? Sometimes maybe you're calling that moment by moment calling is you just taking responsibility for your life, that your mess doesn't become somebody else's mess. Or just taking responsibility for what God has entrusted to you. Maybe that's God's calling in your life. Your moment by moment. So we've got the macro. God's called you to be light. How you do that, maybe God's calling you to start a new business, to push against darkness and usher in light in our community. Or maybe God's just asking you to be faithful to stand up for somebody who can't stand for themselves. So it begins with God's calling. I want you to also see that it also requires that we listen to God. If you want to know what God's calling in your life is, whether it's the macro big level or the micro small incremental moment by moment things, then you've got to be listening to God. Noah listened to God. God came to him. God warned him. Noah obeyed because he first listened. By the way, our world is so loud. I don't know if your world is as loud as mine, but my world is loud, and it makes it really difficult for me to listen to God. In fact, I think this is probably fairly true of most of us in the room, that it's hard to be silent with the Lord, right? In the moments of silence, right, we got to turn on the radio. We got to turn on the TV. We need some white noise to sleep to at night. It's hard to be silent, and yet it's when we're silent when we're able to hear the small, still voice of the Lord. You know, I love kind of this moment between Eli the prophet and Samuel, his young protege. Samuel, who's kind of working it out to try to figure out what it means to walk with the Lord and to hear from the Lord. And he's thinking he's hearing from Eli, and he runs to Eli and he says, Eli, what do I do? I'm keep hearing my name called. And Eli responds back to Samuel and he says, Samuel, that's the Lord speaking to you. Simply just say, Lord, your servant is listening. And then be quiet and listen. So often we come to the Lord with all the things we need him to do for us. And you know what? Rightly so. You ask not, or you have not because you ask not. But also, the Lord wants to speak to you. And there's something powerful when we can get alone with him, open up his word and just say, Lord, your servant is listening. Speak to my heart. I need to hear from you this morning. If you want to know what God is calling you to, if you want to discern that, whether it's moment by moment or whether it's something big that God has for you, it's going to require that you listen to him, which means you're going to have to walk with him. Thirdly, this is pretty good. Noah believed God. You have to believe God. I mean, think about this, right? Like God calls Noah to the unthinkable. Hey, Noah, I want you to build something that you've never seen with no guarantee that I'm going to show up and do what I say I'm going to do. Good luck. I mean, no doubt, right? Again, Noah's just like you and me, right? There's no doubt that Noah goes through a roller coaster of emotions of what ifs and, well, what if God doesn't show up? Well, what if people think I'm crazy? Or what if I'm not the right person? Or what if I don't have what it takes? I mean, think about that. God calls him to do this crazy astronomical thing where he's going to look like a fool to the rest of his community. All of the emotions of what he must have gone through. Think about all of the times where he's like, oh God, surely not me. Oh, I can't do this. I'm not equipped for this. I don't have what it takes. And yet he just simply trusted that God is who he says he is and he's going to do what he says he does. And so he believed that God was going to show up when he needed him. By the way, did you know that God is faithful and that no matter what God is calling you to, whether it's that macro level or micro level, he is going to protect you. He is going to provide for you. He is going to be with you. God is who he says he is. You only have to, by faith, say, God, I trust you. And then follow him. Just believe him. Believe that all of those promises that we talked about, all 7,500 of those promises are available to you. The only way they're not available to you is if by faith, notice what I'm going to say, by faith you choose not to believe that they're true. It takes just as much faith to believe that they are true as it does to believe that they're not true. God asks us to believe him, to trust him. And then hear this, because this is another good one. Noah feared God more than he feared man. If you're gonna step into God's calling for your life, again, whether that's macro or micro level stuff, you're gonna have to fear God more than you're gonna have to fear man. I mean, this is good. I mean, so often, right? Like we fail to do what God is calling us to do, not because we're unwilling, not because we don't have a willing heart or good intentions, but simply because we're unwilling to fear God over man. You know what I love about Noah? I think, this is my conjecture, this is just my opinion of this story. I think Noah feared missing out on God's blessing more than he feared the temporary consequences of man. Think about that. What is keeping you from doing what God has called you to do? I would venture to say that it's either A, you're not believing that God's gonna show up, or B, you're worried about what somebody's thinking of you. And the person that you're worried about what they think of you, you probably don't even care anyway. I know that's true of my life. I've cared far more about people have thought about me, people that to be honest, I don't really care what they think. And yet here I am, fearful of what they're gonna say about me. Think about it. Noah feared God more than he feared man. When all was in the books, in reverent fear, Noah constructed the ark. He didn't let all the what ifs keep him from following the Lord. He banked his faith on the fact that while I don't have all the answers, what I know to be true is that God is gonna be who he says he's gonna be, and he's gonna do what he says he's gonna do, no matter what anybody else says or thinks. Now here's the last one. And I think this is the hardest one. Noah acted in obedience. See, it's easy. I think it's easy. It's not easy. It's hard to walk with the Lord. But I think it's easy for me to go, okay, Lord, what is it that you want me to do? And I can even hear God say, okay, this is what I want you to do. This is where I want you to take the church. This is where I want you to lead your family. This is what I want you to do today. I can get all that. I can even believe that God's gonna show up. I can even go so far as to say that, Lord, I'm not scared of what man's gonna think about me. I'm gonna do this, I'm gonna stand in the gap, and I'm gonna do it. And it's easy to have all the right intentions and yet not actually do it. To not actually get up and step into the batter's box and to swing, even knowing that I might miss. See, the hardest part about all of this whole faith stuff, is obedience that faith requires. And yet Noah was faithful to obey. Despite all the obstacles, despite the fact that God's calling seemed crazy, despite what everyone else was thinking, despite the fact that he had no guarantee, Noah showed up and he obeyed. I love what Pastor Eugene Peterson talks about of the Christian life. He wrote a book about this, and if you're a reader, I would encourage you to read it because it's really good. It's kind of discouraging, but it's really good. Here's the reason why it's discouraging. Because it's titled, A Long Obedience in the Same Direction. That's what he says that's what the Christian life is. The Christian life is not this spectacle. It's not this like mountaintop thing. He said more often than not for the most of us, it's just faithful obedience in the same direction over the course of your life. And so this morning, you may be sitting here and maybe, just maybe, God is calling you to a Noah-like, I want you to build an ark kind of thing. But you know what, for the rest of us, here's probably what God's calling you to do. Be faithful to him in the things that he's given to you. To trust him, to believe him, that he's gonna show up when he says he's gonna show up. For you to be faithful in that moment where somebody's being picked on and you stand in the gap. To be faithful at work, that even though it might cost you your job, for you to step aside and say, no, I'm not gonna stand for this. To be faithful in the moments of your life with what God has called you to steward and to care for. Here's what's gonna happen, I think. I'm gonna go out on a limb and I'm giving you my opinion here. I think at the end of your life, you're gonna look back over the course of your life, and while God didn't call you to build an ark, I think what you're gonna see is at the end of your life, you're gonna look back and go, man, God built an ark with my life. Wow. Like maybe God didn't call me to build an ark in my day and age, but through my life, God used me, and he used my life to build an ark. He pushed darkness back and he ushered in light. He exposed darkness with me. He used my life to bring some level of hope and clarity to this world that is so murky and so riddled with relativism and all of this nonsense that you can't tell me that you're not hungry for truth. Over the course of your life, over the course of a faithful life, pursuing the Lord and living faithful to him, God will build an ark with your life. The question is just, what kind of ark is he gonna build? What kind of ark is he going to build? I want you to think about that this week. I want that to be on your mind, that question. God, what kind of an ark are you building with my life today? In this moment, with this decision that I'm making today. Let's pray. God, we come to you today and we thank you that, Lord, you are faithful to us and you're faithful to build an ark, even when we don't know it and we can't see it. So Lord, even in the brokenness, this broken shell of a life that we live, God, I pray that you would just pick up the pieces and that you would make something beautiful with our lives. God, for those in the room that are being called to literally build some form of an ark for our community in this day and time, in our generation, God, I pray that you would empower them and give them the strength and the courage to do so. I pray for those who are called to support that calling. Lord, I pray that you would give them the encouragement to do so. Lord, we all need those people in our lives. God, for those maybe in the room who just need to come and just to receive from the Lord right now because of all the things that are going on in their life, Lord, I just pray that, Lord, they would sit in that calling for this season and that you would minister to them and that they would feel your love and your presence. And then, Lord, I pray that you would just give us the grace, the moment by moment grace to help see, Lord, that you are not finished with us, that you are doing something in our life, and that over the course of maybe the 50, 60, 70, 80, maybe for some of us, the 90 to 100 years that you give us, Lord, may we see, God, the beautiful ark that you create, a life of hope, a life of clarity, all pointing to your son, Jesus. It's in his name we pray. Amen.